As Kim mentioned, I'm Geoff Elliot, and my presentation is Understanding Conservation Education's Impact on Youth, Rocky Mountain Conservancy's core program. Before I dive into the presentation, I just want to thank Kim, Brett, and Leanne for their help in putting some of this together. And so, kind of, what was the research problem or the focus this summer? And it was really focused around exploring the impacts of service learning programs on the conservation psychology in youth or young adults. Youth is kind of our 14 to 25 age group is what I'm identifying it as here. And it came out of sort of two driving forces. One, Rocky Mountain Conservancy has a Next Generation Fund, which is a large endowment fund that funds a suite of different programs focused on developing the next generation of conservationists or public land stewards. And so to identify kind of how the organization is being successful in that way, as well as to understand what parts of the programs are those that foster the greatest change, to be able to kind of translate that to either other programs or share with other organizations and researchers. And so what were the goals? First, to understand what influences conservation-related decision-making and behavior. And so that was largely done through a literature review in advance of the on-the-ground work, whereas the second two goals were really focused on the ground, with recognizing programmatic impact on young people's perceptions, attitudes, understandings, and then behaviors, as well as, again, identifying those programmatic components. And some of the objectives were, one, to develop an evaluative tool, which we'll get a quick look at in the presentation, and then to actually implement that within Rocky Mountain Conservancy, compile those results, and then work to share those with folks. And so this is one of those opportunities, as well as I'll be presenting at a national conference and then putting some other proposals to present as well. So I mentioned conservation psychology. Well, what is it? So the goal of conservation psychology, or kind of where it comes out of, is efforts to understand what motivates behaviors related to the environment, or pro-environmental, pro-conservation behaviors, and kind of really started to take steam, at least in the research that I did, through a paper published by Kulmis and Egg called Mind the Gap, which brought forth and kind of some research that education did not necessarily equate to action, and there was a gap there between kind of that classic sage on the stage park ranger experience, not quite making it to promoting those behaviors. And what came out was that there's a lot of different factors that play into this. And so there's internal factors, and those can be a person's values. So do you value clean air, or do you value convenience? Kind of where do you fall on that spectrum? And then beliefs, how do you relate? What's your perception with the natural world? Self-efficacy. So this is more kind of how you understand your ability to make an impact on the natural environment. You can think of it falling into, a good example would be in climate change. It's this large, daunting problem. And how does an individual make an impact on that? And so how do you understand, are you able to make an impact as one individual or not? And then understanding, and this understanding transcends that sort of like, I understand ecological processes, but more of understanding what behaviors you can engage in, as well as what the impacts of different behaviors or the absence of those behaviors. And then there are external factors too, so things that are largely out of the control of an individual. And so one of those social norms, if you think about those little plastic things that all the soda cans used to come in, might be a social norm in a group to cut those up before you throw them away. And that might foster someone engaging in that behavior into the future, whereas in other social settings that might not be. Also economic. In a lot of ways we think of this, or you hear about this as a barrier to conservation behavior. It's too expensive, or I can't get to this place to participate in an activity. But it can also be incentivizing as well. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. And then additionally, institutional structures. So think about Fort Collins. Fort Collins has great infrastructure around biking, and that makes biking a much easier choice to make. Whereas in Estes Park, where I live, there's not that much, and it makes biking much more difficult to do in that community. And then accessibility. And the easiest way to understand this one is we think about recycle bins or trash cans. If there's not easy access to those facilities, you're much less likely to engage in those behaviors, even if everything else falls in line. And so with all of that, the myriad of factors that influence behavior, it's sort of daunting to think about how do you foster environmental stewardship. Fortunately, some research is out there to kind of facilitate programmatic growth. And one of those is linking education to behavior. So if you think about action-oriented knowledge, not just educating folks on invasive species and how they can degrade a natural ecosystem, but educating them on how they can mitigate that or how they can remove them once invasive species do move in. And on that same note, making sure that the education and the action-oriented knowledge is relevant to an area. So up in Rocky Mountain National Park, it would probably not be the best choice to teach people about lionfish as an invasive species because they're not there, whereas focusing more on musk thistle or woolly mullein might be a more appropriate outlook. And then thinking about incentives as a way to promote conservation-based behavior. So especially financial incentives, you can think of payment for ecosystem services, tax credits, things like that help foster those behaviors, as well as other extrinsic or external motivators, whether those be regulatory practices like law enforcement, trying to impose regulations. But the reality is, it all really comes down to that intrinsic motivation, especially for the long term, it being the most sustainable long-term way to foster that behavior. And those incentives or extrinsic motivators can be seen as a means to an end, a way to habituate pro-conservation behaviors or behaviors related to the environment. And then two other just interesting kind of themes that came up in my research was the role of relationships in making effective programmatic interventions. You hear this a lot in the developing world, where the relationship between the conservation practitioner and the conservation audience can be poor or not strong, and that really affects the conservation practitioner's ability to kind of implement change in those areas. So, as far as in this research, recognizing the role of leadership in programming to create that strong relationship and hopefully foster those behavior changes. And then lastly, and this is important as far as the survey goes, outdoor recreation, specifically appreciative outdoor recreation. So this would be the non-extractive, so hiking, climbing, camping, biking, those sorts of things, as opposed to fishing or hunting. They have been associated with ecocentric environmental attitudes. So ecocentrism coming out of the field of environmental ethics, where as opposed to anthropocentrism, the ecosystem is included in decision making. So stepping kind of out of general conservation psychology and looking towards youth in particular, since that is the target audience for these programs. There's a notion of environmental science agency, which is really about creating an identity that is focused and inclusive of the environment, and not just focusing on decision making itself, but looking at the larger picture. And so what that would require is making sure that the knowledge that's being obtained, so that action-oriented knowledge and it's just the issues or the concerns that it's associated with, align with people's values and beliefs. So kind of making congruency across that understanding and those other internal factors. But some of the other things that can contribute to this in a positive way or negatively is time, relationship to place, and applicability. So if we look at Rocky Mountain National Park, you're more likely to have that kind of align with your values and belief if you've spent a lot of time there, you have a strong relationship with that place, and the knowledge that you're developing is applicable in that location. But the reality is, unfortunately, there's not a simple formula. So it's not a one part beliefs, one part understanding, one part social norms, and then you have the solution. It's complicated, and it can be seen through some of the research that's been done recently. So we all are probably somewhat familiar with Richard Liu's Last Child in the Woods, claiming or coining the term nature deficit disorder. And then some other research that's actually attributed this to larger societal trends towards technology. Actually, a kind of gap in the social structure, which has removed people's sense of personal accountability, largely due to technology, and then consumerism at large, which is highly extractive. So continuing to distance people from the source of these things. So how did all this research kind of translate into the capstone work? Let me catch up. So the two programmatic interventions that I looked at. One is our Conservation Corps program at Rocky Mountain Conservancy. And this is a longer standing program. We just actually finished our 15th season this year. And it's a long program, summer-long internships for college-age students within that 18 to 25 kind of age range, focused on completing on-the-ground work in Rocky Mountain National Park and the surrounding Arapahoe-Roosevelt National Forest. And throughout those 11 weeks, 8 of those weeks are committed to working with those agencies on conservation projects, whereas the other 3 weeks are sort of divided between trainings specific to kind of soft skills and then more job-specific trainings, education on the natural and cultural resources of these areas, as well as career development. So kind of where do you take what you gained and where does it go next? So in this last season, in 2017, we had 36 participants in total. And they came from all over the country, although we do try and target more locally, but they do come from all over. And the program really focuses on developing job skills, fostering that conservation ethic, so kind of the basis for this research, and then supporting on-the-ground projects, helping those agencies kind of further their conservation missions. And a lot of the people that come to the Conservation Corps are on that career trajectory, or they are already kind of engaged and interested, or it's something that they want to go on to do as a career. Whereas the High School Leadership Corps is kind of a different take on the same sort of program. And this was established just this past year. Our pilot summer was 2017. And the program structure came both out of the success of the Conservation Corps over the years and through some of this research. And this was a 12-day service learning program, so it was highly immersive. High school students came to Rocky Mountain National Park, camped for 11 nights, and spent 12 days there. And we also completed projects within the park and in the surrounding forests, but it was a smaller program. Only had 10 participants. And with the 12 days that they spent there, it was divided up in a similar fashion in that we had some kind of development activities as well as the service learning projects, but with kind of a heavier emphasis on those youth development activities. So we had 4 days where half of it was service learning, and then the other half was either career development, education, leadership trainings, 4 days where it was purely sort of outdoor education, experiential learning, and then 4 days where we did full day on the ground projects. And with that sort of variety of activities, the program was focused on one, kind of completing that on-ground work, but more, I would say more emphasis was placed on sort of the learning component, learning about public lands, developing those leadership skills and those social skills, working together, and then also just kind of connecting with these places, recognizing their value and their importance. And for a lot of these folks, we were actually fortunate to engage people that were largely disconnected from public lands before they came to the program. So as I mentioned, a lot of the work that we do, or that we did, was in the kind of Rocky Mountain National Park, which is an orangish blob in the middle, and then the Arapahoe-Roosevelt National Forest, with the different districts labeled in the surrounding green. And so what's the context in this area? So one, Rocky Mountain National Park and the Arapahoe-Roosevelt are among the most visited federally managed public lands in the country. Rocky Mountain National Park's been in the top 5 for the past several years, and the Arapahoe-Roosevelt ranks within the top 5 if you take away ski visitation. And then, so we have this growing visitation. However, the last survey that was done in Rocky Mountain National Park showed that the visitors were overwhelmingly older than this youth demographic, with almost 60% of them being over the age of 40. And this has been recognized on a national level, if you think about some of the more recent initiatives that have come out to try and increase youth engagement and youth participation on public land. So we have Every Kid in the Park, which came out through the Obama administration, getting every 4th grader a pass if they follow through with some protocols. And then 21st Century Conservation Service Corps, which is much more focused on the sort of young adult category and creating career pathways for them to link their experiences with federal employment. So with this kind of generational divide, high visitation, what's the other end of it? So what's the ecological side? We see this love to death phenomenon really prevalent here in Colorado. There was an article just last week by 5280 focusing purely on this concern, as well as those larger scale threats of climate change, invasive species moving into areas that they haven't been before, acid precipitation, which is pretty particular to Rocky, in the kind of damage that it can cause to the alpine tundra and alpine lakes, as well as human-wildlife conflict. And so this context really underscores the importance that we have these imposing threats that are only getting bigger, and we have an aging demographic of visitors and staff. I can speak from my personal experience with Rocky Mountain Conservancy for 4 years that we've had a superintendent, several chiefs of divisions, and our own executive director retire in just the last 3 years, leaving those high-level leadership roles vacant. And so we need to engage a younger generation to kind of develop and foster this transition that we're going to be going through, especially in the employment field. And so, who are our project partners? As Kim mentioned, I work for Rocky Mountain Conservancy, as well as being a master's student here. And so they were the host organization and the primary project partner. I mentioned the Next Generation Fund, which provided a lot of the project funding, as well as the license plate fund. So for those of us from Colorado, you may have seen those Rocky Mountain National Park license plates. That actually helped fund the high school program. As well as the kind of behind the scenes administrative support, so those HR concerns, whether it be workers' compensation, liability, payroll, those kinds of things. And then as far as the public lands, again, I mentioned the Park Service and the Forest Service. Park Service is kind of the primary partner since we are based up in Estes Park. But we also work really closely with the Forest Service, specifically within the conservation, so the young adult program, where we have 4 crews working on the ground with that agency. And then in the high school leadership corps, we worked closely with the Headwaters Trail Alliance and the Poudre Wilderness Volunteers, both of which are also nonprofits. Headwaters Trail Alliance based out of the Granby Fraser Valley, and then Poudre Wilderness Volunteers here in Fort Collins, providing, and they helped us kind of identify projects that were going to be meaningful for folks, as well as provide some of that on-the-ground support for those projects. So, there's a framework. We got the research, the programs, the partners, the context. So what do we do to kind of understand the impacts? So we developed surveys, which I'll bring up in a moment, and those surveys were anonymous. So the participants who completed them, there was no names attached to them in any way. They were self-administered, meaning that the surveys were provided to the participants, and then those participants completed them on their own time. And they were voluntary, although I will say that we did provide work time for them, and so there was a little bit of incentive to complete them. And the questions within the survey solicited for both quantitative and qualitative data. So we used a Likert scale, 1 to 10, to understand kind of how people self-evaluated themselves on different categories, as well as open-ended questions to recognize any changes or why they had rated themselves at certain levels. And the questions were both about the programmatic goals, which we won't look at much beyond acknowledging that they were part of the survey, and then specific indicators of pro-conservation behavior. And the indicators that, this doesn't work on the screen, were identified were connections with the natural world, so associated with the feelings and belief toward the natural world, people's involvement in conservation activities as an indicator of kind of how they felt about their self-efficacy, their feeling towards outdoor recreation, which as we saw during some of the research was associated with positive attitudes towards the natural world, and then asking them to kind of just evaluate what's your decision making, how do you feel your decision making is related to the environment. And they were completed at 3 different times during the season. The beginning, and so for the high school corps, that was the first day. The college corps, that was the first week. Middle, the 6th week for the college corps, and the 5th day for the high schoolers. And then the end of the season pretty much ended up being the last day for both of the programs. And pardon me while I pull up a survey just to give you guys a glance. And so, as we scroll through this, the survey was split into two parts. Part one being the programmatic goals, and then part two labeled as understanding the impact of conservation education. And in the last survey, so this is the end of season one, we actually evaluated side by side how people felt they were before they began the program and how people felt they were after, so they could take a retrospective look at kind of how they were with their overall change during the season. All right. And so to look at the results of these, first we'll look at the quantitative results and then dive into the more qualitative side. And so for the quantitative results, we looked at from each of the surveys, so you can see the beforing, the mid-survey or during, and then the end of season survey, which both had a before and after component. In each of those, we looked at the mean or the average, as well as the range from the survey responses. And one of the interesting things, we're going to dive a little bit more into the two categories of the end of season survey as it kind of juxtaposed the whole season in one, was that there's an interesting, if you look at the before average and then at the before average from the end of season survey, you notice those numbers went down quite a bit. So you have in the feeling towards the natural world 9.3 down to 7.7. And across, it actually decreases in both of the camps. And I would attribute that to the logic of the more you know you don't know, in that as they learned more about the natural world, they recognized that they maybe knew less than they thought before they started the program, which is a good indicator of change. But the kind of most immediate positive note is that all of the numbers in the end, before and after, you can see an increase in those bumping up, as well as the range is decreasing quite a bit. And so if we look at the specific for the end of season before and after survey in the conservation core, so this is in the young adult program, we see from that 1 to 10 Likert scale, all of them are moving up, which is a good thing. But the most significant changes being in feeling towards outdoor recreation, where that minimum really, really raised, which is a good indication of attitudes growing or more positive attitudes coming out towards the natural world. But then also a really consistent growth in the involvement in environmental stewardship activities, which can be attributed to that's largely the focus of the program. There's 8 weeks spent on the ground. And so I might extrapolate that this is habituated behavior. People are getting used to doing this kind of thing often and thinking in this sort of way. And so there's an intentionality to continue. And then lastly in this, you'll notice that the maximum, so the blue line, in 3 of the 4 charts is actually at 10 to begin with, which, as I mentioned before, a lot of these people that come into the conservation core are already really career-focused, engaged in the outdoors, and so they're already kind of ranking themselves high. And for those folks, if they're already at 10, there's not a lot of change to occur. So that's something we'll address towards the end. In the high school program, the most significant changes we saw were in the feeling towards the natural world. So more of that kind of understanding of your relationship, how you interact with it, your beliefs towards it, as well as some pretty significant growth in the involvement in environmental stewardship activities. And you can see across all of these that sort of the baseline is lower than that conservation core program. It doesn't start at as high of a level, and that is because a lot of these kids were either less familiar with, had never been to, or just kind of dipping their toe in the water for programs like this. And so for the qualitative responses, as I mentioned, each of the quantitative Likert scale questions was paralleled with a how do you reflect upon this change, what did you identify as potential motivations for this change. For the feelings towards nature, one of the biggest things that people mentioned was they felt that the experience, and this is kind of evident in the quantitative thing, but a lot of people said it just reinforced or increased their connection. And this was often associated with becoming more comfortable or developing hands-on experience in the outdoors. And so by developing those skills, people were feeling more connected with it, and it wasn't as alien or as strange to them. And then a lot of them pointed towards they had marked this increase because they were looking forward to their future connection, so to continuing to engage in the natural world and have a strong feeling towards it. And then interestingly, within both the conservation corps and the high school, there was this recognition of kind of the value of nature as well as the potential threats. But in the conservation corps, it went deeper to this like ownership and responsibility. They were developing this sort of accountability towards the environment that made them increase their feeling towards. And then one thing that was resounding, and it'll come up in almost all of these qualitative responses, is just the time. This is pretty intuitive. The more time you spend outdoors, the more likely you are to connect with that space. But it was really, really evident across both programs. And then I think this is more specific to the conservation corps, but a sense of place, spending 8 weeks in one place, working on the ground, getting your hands dirty every day, really just developed like a relationship with specific areas, whether it be the Rewa Wilderness, Rocky Mountain National Park, the Indian Peaks Wilderness. And then with that, the projects, but the projects actually went both ways. Some projects, people felt really connected them, and so whether it be building a bridge on a really popular trail in the Indian Peaks Wilderness that made them feel really attached to that place, or projects that were actually detrimental to people's experience. They didn't find a lot of meaning in them. They felt they were sort of extra projects thrown their way. And then lastly, one of the things that people felt really increased their feeling towards the natural world was their conversations with each other. And so that sort of social setting that's embedded in a crew environment, they were able to kind of share their experiences, share their stories, and that helped people become more engaged. As far as the themes from the involvement in stewardship activities, interestingly, both of the high school and conservation corps, this was the most significant area of growth, but the least significant area of qualitative responses, which I'm not sure why, but some of the major themes that came out were just like a recognition of the opportunities that existed, so that either there were no awareness that you could do this kind of thing, and this is something that you could take wherever you go, or they were just new experiences, like you maybe done litter cleanups or different things like that, but actually getting on the ground and building structures or planting plants made a big difference. And then the sort of desire to kind of continue into the future with activities like this, so to pass on the conservation message that was learned, and then also to maybe apply new skills and bring these to new places. And then again, there's that social component of experiencing this with others and wanting to share the message with others. We actually had some folks, and I remember these particularly from the high school program, that referenced when they're in the city, they're going to discourage their friends from dropping trash on the ground based on their experience of having to pick up trash in the park. So kind of that passing it forward idea. So as far as outdoor recreation, that component, there was certainly, especially within the conservation corps where people are already in this mindset, that it was reinforced. It reinforced their already love for kind of hiking or camping. But then with that, I think when you get on the ground and you recognize what it takes to put in a trail or build a trail, there's a totally different perspective that comes into how you appreciate that place and how you respect it differently. And then in both of them, sort of new experiences. So there's often, when you put crews together, a handful of people that love to hike, some people that love to climb, others that want to stand up paddleboard. And by being able to share those experiences throughout the crew, people are excited to bring something home with them and engage in outdoor recreation differently than maybe they did before. And again, kind of on that same note, being able to share those experiences, the social component, hearing stories, and sharing those new opportunities with each other. On the flip side of this, we did see that some folks said, hold on, this was a lot. And so they wanted a break, they wanted to step back, and they actually, that it was maybe too much, and their interest on a personal level had decreased because it was overwhelming to be engaged in this depth. And then lastly, the decision-making component. And so I think a big part of this, and this echoes the research that was mentioned, this action-oriented knowledge, so the increased awareness of the impact of their behaviors on the natural world and seeing kind of how that's reflected in the work that they were doing, as well as developing habits for the future. And so as I mentioned, when you have those external motivators, sometimes those can habituate pro-conservation behavior. But in this sense, it was more just being around it and being engaged in it throughout that time was able to people wanted to continue moving forward. And there were actually some folks that anticipated immediate changes in what they were going to do, whether those be career changes or some people actually bringing up things that are totally unrelated to the program, like becoming a vegetarian, which can largely be attributed, I think, to the social structure, right? It's those conversations you have amongst each other and understanding like, oh, there's different impacts of these different behaviors, but sort of related to this larger theme. Again, with that sort of the social component, like-minded people made it easy to engage in it. It became easy over the course of the summer because everyone's doing it kind of story. But then both of them, both in the Conservation Corps and the High School Corps, there was this notion of these external barriers that will kind of impact their ability to incorporate this new knowledge into their decision making, and whether those be financial barriers, access barriers, they came up quite often. Some of them were, I want to do this, but I still like everything to be convenient, and so they don't want to go out of their way to do things. So recognizing that there are still those barriers, even in immersive programs like this. And so what were some of the kind of large-scale lessons, themes pulled out from across the board of these qualitative? As I mentioned before, that extended time in the outdoors was really important. It's, whether it be 12 days of camping and living in the outdoors for that amount of time, or 12 weeks of kind of engaging in the outdoors on a weekly basis through your work. And then providing that work-related and recreational experience. So there was a lot of mention of appreciation for trails, understanding the impacts, so that work-related side, as well as those new recreational experiences that help people engage in the natural world in a new and different way. Kind of in that same note, that recreation can provide a gateway to a conservation ethic. People learning new things and being able to engage in outdoor experiences differently offered a way for people to want to engage more deeply. And then the social structure of the program help foster outcomes that I wouldn't have imagined, but still were in line with what we were going for. And that talk about like sharing experiences, sharing stories, engaging in new activities, hearing from others. And all of that is great that it worked out, but it wasn't certainly not a planned for aspect. And then the practicality and relatability of the skills that were learned. And so making sure that the skills that they're gained are tied to something that they can bring home with them. And this is actually both a benefit, like we saw this as something that was a strong suit, as well as an opportunity, because I think there is an opportunity to kind of share how people can engage in these in other aspects and in other ways to the broader audience, since we are impacting a large geographic scope. As far as opportunities for growth, as I mentioned, specific to the Conservation Corps, a lot of those kind of graphs had people at the maximum level to begin with. And so trying to engage folks that had a little bit less experience in the outdoors or less interest would allow the Conservancy to kind of move the needle farther. If someone's already rating themselves at an 8 or 9, you only have to a 10. But if you're bringing in people with less experience, you can have a larger impact on that audience. And then also to identify meaningful projects. So make sure the projects that we're able to work on and plan for in conjunction with the agencies actually have meaning and are relevant, and people are going to have takeaway skills and be proud of the work that they were doing. Because we did have some projects this past summer that maybe people didn't feel that way about, and it actually was a detriment to their experience. And then I didn't bring this up quite yet, but it was something I noticed in the survey results. I used the same evaluation for both the high school and the Conservation Corps in an effort to kind of keep it consistent across programs, but it was really evident in the responses that were received from the high school program that there needs to be a little bit further development of that tool, whether it be using a different methodology, like interviews, or rephrasing the questions to try and solicit for richer responses. And then as mentioned in that recreation kind of downside, making sure you understand the balance for people. Don't overdo it, don't push them too far past their comfort zone, such that it becomes detrimental to the program goals. And then, as I mentioned, with the practicality and relatability of the skills, try and find outlets for folks to know how they can engage in this sort of behavior, whether it be at universities, through clubs or activities, or the municipal city parks, wherever they go back to, how they can continue to do this if it is something they're interested in. And then some more personal takeaways. It was really evident the importance of strong leadership in programs like this. I have the pleasure and the burden of having be the only staff member committed to this program, and so I feel that a lot. And this year, actually, and through some of the self-awareness activities in the CLTL program, felt that I developed at least awareness to recognize where I needed to work and where I didn't. And with that, got some good feedback about how I was able to open up my leadership a little bit more to allow others to step in when necessary. And the next one directly relates, adaptability and field management. So this was our first year doing the high school leadership core. I had hired someone on to help with that program specifically. And the day before that program started, actually the night before, I got a call that he had broken his hand and needed surgery. And so he had put together the curriculum and the programming, but wasn't going to be able to fully be involved. And so with that, I was stepping into teaching his curriculum alongside him, which required a lot more flexibility than I'm used to, having been the one guy for a long time. And so that was a big takeaway in understanding. I probably learned more from him in kind of going through that and working alongside him than I could ever hope to have taught him in as far as program management. And then with the kind of continued emphasis on the social structure, making sure you have strong crew dynamics really makes a difference in this program. And I've seen it kind of year after year, and like you have a good crew and then maybe one that's not so strong, and the experience totally changes for those that don't have a strong dynamic. And this year we were fortunate enough to have 6 crews that all had a really strong dynamic, and then the high school crew coming in for the first time were connected really, really well, and had a good experience. And then the last one is kind of logistical, but it was something that I took away in hopes of maybe presenting this on a larger scale, being sure that I was more prepared in pursuing that sort of research approvals and those sort of things. That's all that I have for you guys. I'd love to take any questions you might have. Or you can clap.